Some stories begin with whispered doubts and end with thunderous applause. This is one of those stories. A testament to the extraordinary power of persistence when the world tells you to settle for ordinary. What you're about to read isn't just a tale of academic triumph or professional success. It's the raw, unfiltered journey of a young woman who transformed her deepest wounds into her greatest weapons. My name is Beatrice Ashworth, and I suppose I should begin this story with a confession. I wasn't always the woman standing before you today. The woman who holds 3 degrees, runs a multi-million-pound consulting firm, and speaks at conferences across Europe. No, I was once the girl who couldn't read properly at age 8, who was told by her own father that she might be better suited for simpler pursuits, and who spent most of her childhood believing she was fundamentally broken. But let me start at the beginning, because every triumph story needs its darkness first. I grew up in a Georgian townhouse in Bath, where expectations hung as heavy as the morning fog that rolled off the River Avon. My father, Reginald Ashworth, was a prominent barrister who spoke in measured tones and wore his Oxford education like a badge of honor. My mother, Penelope, held a doctorate in literature from Cambridge and spent her afternoons hosting book clubs where she discussed Proust with the same intensity other women reserved for gossip. My older brother Jasper was following dutifully in their footsteps. Top of his class at Eton, early acceptance to Oxford, the works. And then there was me. Beatrice is a lovely child, my primary school teacher, Mrs. Whitmore, told my parents during a conference I wasn't supposed to overhear. I was 7, hiding behind the heavy oak door of Father's study, pressing my ear against the cool wood. But I'm afraid she's simply not academically inclined. Her reading comprehension is well below grade level, and she struggles with basic mathematical concepts. Perhaps we should consider alternative educational paths. I didn't understand all the words then, but I understood the tone. I understood the way my parents exchanged those looks, the kind that said everything without saying anything at all. The kind that made my stomach twist into knots that wouldn't untangle for years. That night at dinner, Father set down his fork with deliberate precision and looked at me with those pale blue eyes that always made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Beatrice," he said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment, "your mother and I have been thinking. Perhaps you'd be happier in a more practical program. There's no shame in working with your hands, you know. Some people are simply built for different things." Jasper snickered into his napkin. "Maybe she could learn to arrange flowers," he suggested, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Or make little cakes for tea parties." Mother shushed him, but not with any real conviction. "Jasper, that's enough. Though there are certainly respectable trades for young women who aren't academically minded." Academically minded. The phrase echoed in my head long after I'd been sent to bed. I lay there in my canopy bed, staring at the ceiling with its hand-painted cherubs, wondering what was wrong with me. Why couldn't I read the way Jasper could? Why did numbers seem to swim around on the page like confused fish? Why did everyone else seem to understand things that felt impossible to me? The years that followed were a masterclass in subtle humiliation. My parents enrolled me in a special school. They never called it that directly, but the euphemisms were thick as honey. Kingsley Academy for Individual Learning. The brochure was full of cheerful phrases about alternative educational approaches and nurturing different learning styles. What it really meant was, this is where you send the children who can't keep up. My classmates at Kingsley were a mixed bunch. Some had legitimate learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, processing disorders. Others, like me, seemed to have simply been written off by families who couldn't be bothered to dig deeper. The teachers were kind enough, but there was a pervasive sense of lowered expectations that hung over the place like a gray cloud. "Don't worry about the advanced mathematics, Beatrice," my teacher, Mr. Pemberton, would say with a patronizing smile. "Let's focus on the basics. There's plenty of time for that." But time wasn't infinite, was it? Every day I spent in remedial classes was a day further behind my peers. Every simplified assignment was another reminder that I was different, lesser, broken. At home, the message was reinforced daily. Jasper would breeze through his homework in 30 minutes while I struggled for hours with worksheets designed for children years younger than me. Family dinners became exercises in intellectual intimidation, with father and mother discussing legal precedents and literary theory while I pushed peas around my plate, feeling invisible. "Beatrice, darling, you're awfully quiet," mother would say occasionally, as if suddenly remembering I existed. "How was school today?" And I'd mumble something about art class or PE, because those were the only subjects where I didn't feel completely inadequate. I learned to become small, to take up as little space as possible at that mahogany dining table that seemed to stretch for miles. The breaking point came when I was 14. Jasper had just received early acceptance to Oxford, following in father's footsteps naturally, and the celebration dinner felt like a funeral for my own ambitions. The champagne flowed freely, and the conversation sparkled with talk of Jasper's bright future in law. "We're so proud," Mother gushed, her cheeks flushed with wine and pride. "It's wonderful to have at least one child who inherited the family intelligence." The words hit me like a physical blow. At least one child. As if my presence at the table was nothing more than a disappointing reminder of genetic lottery failure. Father raised his glass. "To Jasper," he declared, his voice booming through the dining room. "May he carry on the Ashworth tradition of excellence." I excused myself and ran to my room, tears streaming down my face. But as I sat there on my bed, surrounded by the evidence of my academic failures, returned papers marked with red ink, participation ribbons instead of achievement awards, something shifted inside me. The hurt began to crystallize into something harder, more dangerous. Anger. I was tired of being the family disappointment. Tired of being spoken about as if I wasn't in the room. Tired of accepting that I was simply not academically minded, without anyone ever bothering to find out why. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to prove them wrong. Not just my family, but everyone who had ever looked at me with pity or dismissal. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to try. The first step was getting out of Kingsley Academy. I researched state schools in our area and found Millfield Comprehensive, a large secondary school with a reputation for being rough around the edges but academically solid. I presented my case to my parents with the kind of methodical preparation Father used in court. "I want to transfer to Millfield," I announced over breakfast one morning. Father looked up from his newspaper, eyebrows raised. "Millfield? That's a state school, Beatrice. Hardly appropriate for a girl of your circumstances." "My circumstances?" I asked, feeling that familiar anger bubbling up. "You mean my inability to learn? Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that everyone has given up on me before giving me a real chance." Mother pursed her lips. "Darling, we haven't given up. We've simply found an environment that suits your capabilities better." "My capabilities?" I repeated slowly. "Tell me, Mother, what exactly do you think my capabilities are?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Neither parent seemed able to answer it. "I want to try," I said finally. "I want to see what happens when someone actually expects something of me for once." After weeks of arguments and negotiations, they finally agreed. Partly, I suspect, because they thought I would fail spectacularly and come crawling back to the safety of low expectations. Millfield Comprehensive was a shock to my system. The building was concrete and glass instead of red brick and ivy. The students wore polyester uniforms instead of wool, and most of them spoke with accents my parents would have sniffed at. But there was something else there too. An energy, a hunger that I'd never encountered at Kingsley. My first day was terrifying. I was placed in average-level classes based on my previous academic record, and I felt like an imposter sitting there with my crisp uniform and posh accent. But then something extraordinary happened. My English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, handed back our first essays with comments that weren't just corrections, but actual feedback. "Interesting perspective, Beatrice," her note read in neat handwriting. "Your analysis of Macbeth's guilt shows real insight. I'd like to see you push this thinking further. Come see me after class." When was the last time a teacher had used the word insight in reference to my work? I couldn't remember. Ms. Rodriguez kept me after class and looked at me with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You're not from around here," she observed. "No, miss. I transferred from Kingsley Academy." Her eyebrows shot up. "That's quite a change. What brought you to Millfield?" I could have lied, could have made up some story about my parents' financial troubles or a family move. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. About feeling stupid, about being written off, about wanting to prove that I was more than everyone thought I was. Ms. Rodriguez listened without interruption, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "Beatrice," she said finally, "I think you might have been underestimated. Your writing shows sophisticated thinking. It's disorganized, yes, and your spelling needs work, but the ideas are there. Have you ever been tested for learning differences? Learning differences. Not learning disabilities. Differences. The distinction felt monumental. My parents had me evaluated when I was younger, I said. They said I wasn't particularly bright. Ms. Rodriguez frowned. When was this? And who conducted the evaluation? As it turned out, my evaluation had been a brief meeting with the family doctor when I was 6, during which my struggles with reading were attributed to late development, and left at that. No one had thought to dig deeper, to consider that perhaps my brain simply processed information differently. Ms. Rodriguez arranged for me to see the school's educational psychologist, Dr. Hartwell. The testing took 3 sessions, and at the end of it, Dr. Hartwell sat me down with results that rewrote my entire understanding of myself. Beatrice, she said, spreading papers across her desk, you have dyslexia and dyscalculia, both quite severe. But you also have something else. She pointed to a number on one of the charts. Your cognitive reasoning scores are in the 95th percentile. Do you know what that means? I shook my head, afraid to hope. It means you're exceptionally intelligent. Your brain just processes written information differently than most people's. With the right support and strategies, there's no limit to what you can achieve academically. I stared at those numbers until they blurred through my tears. 95th percentile. All those years of being told I wasn't smart enough, wasn't capable enough, wasn't enough, and it turned out my brain had been working harder than almost anyone else's just to make sense of a world designed for neurotypical learners. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Learning to read with dyslexia at age 15 was like learning to run with weights strapped to your ankles. Possible, but requiring 10 times the effort of everyone else. Dr. Hartwell connected me with specialists who taught me coping strategies. Colored overlays for reading, text-to-speech software, mind mapping for organizing my thoughts. But more importantly, she helped me understand that intelligence isn't measured solely by how quickly you can decode text or manipulate numbers. Intelligence is pattern recognition, creative problem-solving, the ability to see connections others miss. And in those areas, I was beginning to discover, I was rather gifted. Ms. Rodriguez became my greatest champion. She pushed me to take advanced English courses, helped me develop study strategies that worked with my brain instead of against it. When I struggled with reading assignments, she provided audiobook versions. When written exams proved challenging, she arranged for me to take them orally when possible. Slowly, incrementally, my grades began to improve. Not just improve, soar. By the end of my first year at Millfield, I was scoring in the top 10% of my class. By my second year, I was in advanced placement courses. And by my final year, I was head girl and had been accepted to read philosophy, politics, and economics at University College London. The day I received my A-level results, 3 A*S and an A, I drove home to Bath with shaking hands and a heart full of vindication. I found my family in the conservatory, having their usual afternoon tea ritual. Beatrice! Mother exclaimed when she saw me. How lovely! How did your results go? I hope you're not too disappointed if they're not quite what you hoped. I placed the results slip on the coffee table between the bone china teacups and homemade scones. The silence that followed was worth every moment of struggle. Every night I'd stayed up late fighting with words that wouldn't stay still on the page. Father picked up the paper with trembling fingers. This can't be right. 3 A*S, I said quietly. And an A in further mathematics, despite my dyscalculia. Oh, and I've been accepted to UCL with a partial academic scholarship. Jasper snatched the paper from Father's hands, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. The golden child was no longer the only shining star in the Ashworth constellation. How is this possible? Mother whispered. Your teachers at Kingsley said. My teachers at Kingsley never bothered to look beyond my learning differences, I interrupted. They saw the dyslexia and decided that was all there was to see. It turns out there was rather a lot more. The conversation that followed was stilted, awkward. My parents seemed genuinely bewildered by this turn of events, as if I'd suddenly revealed I could fly or speak to animals. They'd invested so heavily in the narrative of my limitations that my success felt like a personal affront to their worldview. But I wasn't finished. Oh, not by a long shot. University was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued ideas over social status. My professors at UCL saw my learning differences as interesting quirks rather than obstacles. Dr. Thornberry, my philosophy tutor, introduced me to mind mapping and voice recording, techniques that worked with my brain's natural patterns. More importantly, she helped me understand that my dyslexia often led to creative insights others missed. Your mind makes connections across vast conceptual distances, she explained. That's not a weakness, Beatrice. In philosophy, economics, and politics, that's a superpower. She was right. My essays, while they took twice as long to write, were consistently marked with comments like, original thinking, and innovative approach. By my final year, I graduated with a first-class honors degree and the university's prize for outstanding academic achievement. The graduation ceremony was held at Royal Festival Hall. My parents attended, their pride feeling hollow and performative. During the reception, Father approached me with champagne and a rehearsed smile. "We're very proud of you, Beatrice," he said. "Though I must say, we always knew you had potential." "Did you?" I asked quietly. "When you told me I should consider practical pursuits, was that knowing I had potential?" The conversation was uncomfortable, but I was done pretending their revisionist history was acceptable. I didn't waste time being angry though. Anger was useful fuel, but it was terrible as a destination. Instead, I channeled that energy into my next goal: a master's degree in international relations at the London School of Economics. USI was a different beast entirely. The student body was international, hyper-competitive, filled with future diplomats and policymakers. My learning differences were irrelevant here. What mattered was the quality of your analysis, the sharpness of your insights, the originality of your thinking. I thrived. My dissertation on economic development in post-conflict societies caught the attention of Professor Vivian Walsh, one of the most respected development economists in Europe. She offered me a research position that would fund my PhD studies while giving me hands-on experience with international development projects. "Your perspective is unique, Beatrice," Professor Walsh told me over coffee in her cramped office overlooking Houghton Street. "You see connections between economic theory and human psychology that most economists miss entirely. It's exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking our field needs." For 3 years, I traveled the world working on international development projects. My learning differences became advantages. My nonlinear thinking helped me see patterns in complex social systems, and my struggles with traditional formats made me better at communicating complex ideas accessibly. My PhD thesis, Beyond Traditional Metrics: Psychological Factors in Economic Development, was published by Cambridge University Press and won the Royal Economic Society's Young Economist Award. The book launch was held at the British Academy, and the guest list included some of the most influential policymakers in Europe. My parents attended, naturally. They sat in the front row, beaming as if they'd been my greatest supporters all along. During the reception, I watched Father holding court near the canopy table, regaling a group of economists with stories about always knowing Beatrice was destined for greatness. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. But the moment that truly crystallized everything came when my former headmaster from Kingsley Academy approached me during the reception. Mr. Felbridge was a thin, nervous man who'd always spoken to me as if I were slightly simple. "Dr. Ashworth," he said, using my new title with obvious discomfort. "What a surprise to see you here. I must say, when I heard about your achievements, I could hardly believe it. We always thought you were such a sweet girl, but academically..." He trailed off, clearly hoping I would fill in the blank with something that would make him feel better about systematically underestimating me for years. "Yes," I prompted, taking a sip of champagne and watching him squirm. "Well, I suppose we all develop at different rates," he finished lamely. "Mr. Felbridge," I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet authority I'd learned from watching Father cross-examine witnesses, "I didn't develop at a different rate. I was failed by an educational system that couldn't be bothered to understand how my mind worked. There's a significant difference." His face flushed red. "Now see here, we did our best with the resources." "Your best was telling my parents I should consider flower arranging as a career," I interrupted smoothly. "Your best was placing me in remedial classes without ever investigating why I was struggling. Your best was convincing a 7-year-old girl that she was fundamentally stupid." The conversation around us had quieted, other guests turning to listen. Professor Walsh appeared at my elbow, her presence both supportive and protective. "But look how well you've turned out," Mr. Felbridge said desperately. Surely our approach couldn't have been that wrong if you've achieved all this. I set down my champagne glass and looked him directly in the eyes. I achieved this in spite of your approach, not because of it. And how many other children didn't? How many brilliant minds have you convinced they're stupid simply because they process information differently? He opened his mouth to respond, but I was no longer interested in his excuses. The success of my book led to consulting opportunities with international organizations. The World Bank wanted my insights on psychological barriers to economic development. The UN asked me to advise on education policy in developing regions. NGOs sought my expertise on making aid programs more culturally sensitive and psychologically informed. Within 2 years of finishing my PhD, I had founded Ashworth Development Consulting. Our approach was revolutionary. Instead of imposing one-size-fits-all solutions, we studied the unique psychological and cultural factors affecting each community and designed interventions accordingly. The most satisfying moment came when I delivered the keynote address at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Standing at Chatham House, speaking to hundreds of diplomats and policymakers, I thought about that 7-year-old girl who'd been told she wasn't academically minded. After the lecture, a young graduate student named Fiona approached me. She had severe dyslexia and wondered if she was fooling herself pursuing academics. Fiona, I told her, your brain works differently, not worse. Every time someone tells you that you're not capable of something, they're really telling you about the limits of their own imagination, not your potential. 6 months later, she'd received distinction on her master's thesis and been accepted to a PhD program at Oxford. That email sits framed on my office wall, next to my degrees and awards. Because that's what this story is really about. Not just my triumph over low expectations, but the ripple effect of refusing to accept other people's limitations on our potential. Last month, I received an invitation that felt like the universe's sense of humor at work. Kingsley Academy was hosting a fundraising gala and wanted me as their keynote speaker. The irony was delicious. The school that had written me off was now hoping to bask in the reflected glory of my success. I almost declined. But then I thought about all the children currently sitting in those same classrooms, being told they're not academically minded, being shuffled toward practical pursuits, because their brains work differently than the narrow expectations of traditional education. So I accepted. The evening of the gala, I stood in the same assembly hall where I'd once been told I might never graduate secondary school. The walls were lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, all Oxford and Cambridge graduates, all following predictable paths to predictable success. My speech was titled, The Danger of Low Expectations, and I didn't pull any punches. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at the crowd of parents, teachers and trustees. I stand before you tonight as living proof of this institution's greatest failure. Not its greatest success, its greatest failure. The room was so quiet you could hear the antique clock ticking in the corner. 15 years ago, I sat in these very seats, convinced that I was stupid because everyone around me had decided that learning differences were evidence of inferior intelligence. I was told to lower my expectations, to accept a diminished future, to be grateful for whatever small success I might achieve. I saw Mr. Felbridge in the third row, his face pale as parchment. Tonight, I run a company worth tens of millions of pounds. I advise governments and international organizations. I've published research that's changing how we think about human development. And I did all of this not because of the education I received here, but in spite of it. The speech lasted 20 minutes, but its impact lasted much longer. By the end of the evening, the school had committed to completely overhauling their approach to learning differences. They established a fund for proper educational assessments and hired specialists trained in supporting neurodiverse learners. More importantly, 3 families approached me that night to say their children had been written off by other schools, and my story had given them hope that there might be other options. One of those children was 8-year-old Rupert Sinclair, whose parents had been told he would never succeed academically due to severe ADHD and processing delays. Today, 2 years later, Rupert is thriving in a specialized program, building robots and coding computer games with the kind of focused intensity that his teachers once mistook for inability to concentrate. Another was 16-year-old Imogen Webb, who'd been advised to pursue vocational training instead of A-levels due to her autism and social anxiety. She's now studying astrophysics at Imperial College and has already co-authored a paper on gravitational waves. These stories, these victories, are what matter most to me now. Because I learned something important during my journey from the girl hiding behind study doors to the woman speaking at international conferences. Success isn't just about proving your doubters wrong. It's about changing the system so future generations don't have to fight the same battles. My company now partners with schools across the UK, training teachers to recognize and nurture different types of intelligence. We've developed assessment tools that look beyond traditional metrics to identify potential that might otherwise be overlooked. Our scholarship program has funded education for over 200 students with learning differences, many of whom are now pursuing advanced degrees and groundbreaking research. Last week, I received a handwritten letter from a 12-year-old girl named Poppy Harrison. Her handwriting was shaky, clearly written with significant effort, but her words were crystal clear. "Dear Dr. Ashworth," it read, "my teacher told me about you and how you have dyslexia like me but still became really successful. I wanted to say thank you for showing me that being different doesn't mean being less. My mum says I can be anything I want to be now, and I believe her because of your story. I want to be a scientist who discovers new planets. Do you think that's possible for someone like me?" I wrote back immediately, "Dear Poppy, not only is it possible, it's probable. The same mind that struggles with traditional reading often excels at spatial reasoning and pattern recognition, exactly the skills you need for astronomy. The universe is vast and full of patterns waiting to be discovered by someone who thinks differently enough to see them." That letter exchange reminded me why I share my story, why I speak at conferences and write articles and push for systemic change. It's not about my personal vindication anymore, though I won't pretend that didn't feel satisfying. It's about ensuring that the next generation of neurodiverse children doesn't have to waste years believing they're broken when they're actually just different. Today, when I walk through the offices of Ashworth Development Consulting, I see a team that reflects the diversity of human intelligence. We have colleagues with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and other neurological differences working alongside neurotypical staff. Our conference room walls are covered with mind maps, visual displays, and tactile planning tools because we've learned that the best solutions emerge when different types of minds collaborate. The financial success is gratifying. Certainly. The professional recognition is validating. But the real triumph is in the emails I receive from parents whose children are now thriving in schools that understand their needs. It's in the research papers published by former students who were once told they weren't university material. It's in the slow but steady cultural shift that's beginning to value intellectual diversity over conformity. My parents and I have a better relationship now, though it will never be uncomplicated. They've made efforts to understand and acknowledge their mistakes, and I've learned to forgive without forgetting. Jasper, interestingly, has become one of my strongest supporters. He left law 3 years ago to become a learning differences advocate, working to reform educational policy at the government level. "I spent years watching you struggle," he told me recently over dinner, "and I was too young and too focused on my own success to realize that the struggle wasn't your fault. You were working 10 times harder than I ever had to, just to achieve basic competency in a system designed to defeat you." When I finally understood that, it changed how I see everything. The work continues. Last month, we launched a new initiative working with technology companies to develop learning platforms that adapt to different neurological profiles. We're partnering with researchers at Cambridge to study the connection between learning differences and innovation in STEM fields. Our newest project involves training corporate HR departments to recognize and value neurodivergent talent during recruitment processes. Because here's what I've learned: the traits that make traditional education challenging for some students, the tendency to think in pictures rather than words, to see global patterns before local details, to question established processes and imagine alternative approaches. These are exactly the qualities that drive innovation and creativity in the real world. The technology sector is finally beginning to understand this. Companies like Google, Microsoft, and Apple are actively recruiting neurodiverse talent because they've discovered that autism, ADHD, and dyslexia often correlate with exceptional abilities in pattern recognition, systematic thinking, and creative problem-solving. But we're just scratching the surface. For every success story, there are still countless children sitting in classrooms right now, being told they're not smart enough, not capable enough, not worth the extra effort required to unlock their potential. That's why I tell this story. Not because I need validation, I have plenty of that now. I tell it because somewhere out there is another 7-year-old hiding behind a door, listening to adults decide their future based on outdated assumptions about intelligence and ability. I want that child to know that other people's inability to see your potential doesn't diminish its existence. I want them to know that the very traits that make you struggle in traditional settings might be the exact qualities that allow you to change the world in ways others can't imagine. Most importantly, I want them to know that you don't have to wait for permission to prove your worth. You don't need other people to believe in you before you can believe in yourself. Sometimes the greatest gift is being underestimated, because it means when you finally reveal your true capabilities, the impact is earth-shattering. The journey from that frightened 7-year-old to the woman I am today wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, nights when I wondered if everyone else was right and I was simply deluding myself. During my second year at university, I failed my first statistics exam spectacularly. The numbers had swum around the page like angry wasps, and despite hours of preparation, I couldn't make sense of the mathematical relationships the questions demanded. I sat in my tiny student flat afterward, staring at the red-marked paper, feeling all those old familiar voices creeping back. Maybe father was right. Maybe I was reaching too high, trying to be something I fundamentally wasn't. Maybe I should accept that some dreams were simply beyond my grasp. But then I remembered something Dr. Hartwell had told me during those early testing sessions. Intelligence isn't about never struggling, Beatrice. It's about what you do when struggle becomes inevitable. So I did what intelligent people do when conventional approaches fail. I innovated. I sought out Dr. Patricia Henley, a mathematics tutor who specialized in working with dyslexic students. Instead of trying to force my brain to process numbers the traditional way, she taught me to visualize statistical concepts as spatial relationships. Think of regression analysis as mapping the shape of data, she explained, using colored blocks and three-dimensional models. Your brain excels at seeing patterns across space and time. Let's use that. The transformation was remarkable. Once I stopped fighting my brain's natural inclinations and started working with them, statistics became not just manageable but fascinating. I retook the exam 6 months later and scored in the top 5% of the class. That experience taught me something crucial about resilience. It's not about being strong enough to push through obstacles unchanged. It's about being flexible enough to find new paths when the obvious ones are blocked. This philosophy became central to how I approached every challenge that followed. When traditional networking events felt overwhelming due to my difficulty processing conversations in noisy environments, I started hosting small, focused dinner parties where meaningful professional relationships could develop naturally. When public speaking initially terrified me because of my reading difficulties, I learned to speak extemporaneously from visual mind maps rather than written notes. Each adaptation made me not just more successful, but more innovative. The strategies I developed to work around my learning differences often proved more effective than conventional approaches, not just for me, but for others as well. This is why our consulting firm has been so successful. We don't try to fit people into existing systems. We design systems that work for people as they actually are, not as we think they should be. Our work in Rwanda was particularly meaningful. Traditional literacy programs for genocide survivors had failed miserably. Instead of imposing external standards, we learned from the communities themselves, discovering brilliant oral storytellers and sophisticated thinkers who simply needed educational approaches that recognized their existing strengths. We developed a program integrating literacy learning with existing knowledge systems. Literacy rates improved by 400%. The UN named it a model for international initiatives, and Harvard Business School wrote a case study about our methods. But success also brought new challenges. With higher visibility came higher stakes. And with higher stakes came more people eager to see me fail. The consulting world, particularly at the international level, can be ruthlessly competitive and surprisingly sexist. Being a young woman with learning differences running a major firm made me a target for those who preferred their leaders to fit more traditional molds. I remember one particularly brutal experience during a pitch to the European Commission. We were competing for a €50 million contract to redesign education systems across Eastern Europe. Our proposal was innovative, well-researched, and based on proven results from our previous work. The selection committee was composed entirely of middle-aged men who seemed skeptical from the moment I walked into the room. During my presentation, I noticed them exchanging glances and subtle smirks. When I finished, the lead commissioner, a pompous man named Dr. Wilhelm Hoffman, leaned back in his chair with barely concealed condescension. "Ms. Ashworth," he began, deliberately using MS instead of Dr. "Despite my introduction, your proposals are certainly creative. But this is a serious undertaking requiring proven educational expertise. Are you certain your organization has the necessary gravitas for such an important project?" Gravitas. The word hung in the air like a challenge. What he really meant was, "Are you certain a young woman with learning disabilities can handle something this important?" I could have responded with anger. I could have listed my credentials, rattled off our success statistics, demanded the respect my achievements had earned. Instead, I did something unexpected. I smiled. "Dr. Hoffman," I said, emphasizing his title while maintaining perfect composure, "you raise an excellent point about the importance of proven expertise. Perhaps we should examine the track record of traditional approaches to education reform in the regions we're discussing." I opened my laptop and projected a series of graphs showing the abysmal failure rates of conventional education initiatives across Eastern Europe over the past decade. Billions of euros invested, minimal improvements in outcomes, persistent achievement gaps that traditional methods had been unable to address. These results, I continued, represent the gravitas of established approaches. Respectful deference to methods that don't work isn't wisdom. It's institutional inertia. I then walked them through our alternative approach, backed by data from 12 successful implementations across 4 continents. By the time I finished, the mood in the room had shifted completely. Dr. Hoffman was taking notes, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and scalability. We won the contract. More importantly, the project's success opened doors across the European Union. Within 2 years, we were working with education ministries in 8 countries, training thousands of teachers in approaches that recognized and celebrated cognitive diversity rather than simply tolerating it. The professional victories were satisfying, but the personal moments remained the most powerful. Like the afternoon I spent with Tobias Kensington, a brilliant 10-year-old with autism who'd been excluded from mainstream schools because his intense interests and communication differences were seen as disruptive. Tobias knew more about marine biology than most university students, but he'd been labeled as having behavioral problems, because he couldn't sit still during lessons that bored him and struggled with social interactions that felt meaningless and forced. "Adults are strange," he told me matter-of-factly during our conversation. "They say they want children to be curious and love learning, but then they get upset when you ask too many questions or know more about something than they do." His observation was both heartbreaking and profound. How often do we punish children for displaying exactly the intellectual passion and independence we claim to value? Working with Tobias's family, we found him a specialized school that channeled his interests into formal learning. His obsession with marine life became the gateway to advanced studies in biology, chemistry, and environmental science. His need for precise, logical communication made him an excellent writer of scientific reports. Last year, at age 14, Tobias published his first research paper on microplastic contamination in British coastal waters. The study, conducted in collaboration with marine biologists at Plymouth University, has influenced environmental policy and earned international attention. When I attended the presentation of his findings at the Marine Conservation Society's annual conference, watching this remarkable young man explain complex environmental science to an audience of PhD researchers, I was reminded of why this work matters so deeply. Tobias's parents approached me afterward, both crying. "We almost gave up," his mother whispered. "The schools kept telling us he was too difficult, too different. If we hadn't met you, if we hadn't learned about alternative approaches." "But you did learn," I told them. "And look what Tobias has accomplished when given the right environment to flourish." These individual stories accumulate into something larger. A growing movement of families, educators, and institutions who are beginning to understand that neurodiversity isn't a problem to be solved but a resource to be celebrated. The work has taken me to places I never imagined when I was struggling through my GCSEs. I've testified before Parliament about education reform. I've consulted with the World Health Organization on mental health policy. I've been appointed to the board of the British Dyslexia Association and serve on advisory committees for 3 international research foundations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 years ago, I received a letter with familiar handwriting, spidery, old-fashioned script that I recognized immediately. It was from Mrs. Whitmore, my primary school teacher who'd first suggested I wasn't academically inclined. She was retired now, she explained, but had been following my career through newspaper articles and professional publications. "Dear Dr. Ashworth," her letter began, "I owe you an apology that is 30 years overdue. When you were my student, I failed to see past your reading difficulties to the brilliant mind underneath. I recommended limiting your educational opportunities based on narrow assessments that captured only a fraction of your capabilities. I was wrong, And my failure of imagination nearly cost the world the contributions you've since made. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing how my story had inspired her to volunteer with adult literacy programs, specifically focusing on learners with disabilities. She'd spent her retirement years trying to undo some of the damage caused by the educational attitude she'd once embodied. I tell every struggling student about you now, she wrote. I tell them that intelligence comes in forms we don't always recognize, and that academic struggles often mask extraordinary gifts. I tell them about the girl who couldn't read properly at 8 but grew up to advise world leaders on education policy. I kept that letter for weeks before responding, reading it over and over, feeling the complicated emotions it stirred up. Anger at the years of misdirection. Sadness for the child I'd been. But also gratitude, for Mrs. Whitmore's courage in admitting her mistakes, and for the reminder of how far we've all come. My response was brief but heartfelt. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for your honesty and for the work you're doing now. We all make decisions based on the information and understanding available to us at the time. What matters isn't the mistakes we've made, but what we do when we learn better. Your volunteer work sounds transformative. Exactly the kind of second-chance education that can change lives. Because that's the truth I've learned. This isn't a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about systems that need changing and people who can choose to be part of that change. My father, now in his 70s, has become an unlikely ally in this work. Last year, he used his legal expertise to help us challenge discriminatory admissions practices at several elite schools. The man who once suggested I consider flower arranging now argues passionately for educational equity in courtrooms across England. I was wrong about you, he told me simply during a recent visit. But more than that, I was wrong about intelligence itself. I thought it was fixed, measurable, hierarchical. You've taught me that it's fluid, diverse, and often hidden where we least expect to find it. Mother has thrown herself into fundraising for Learning Differences research with the same intensity she once brought to her book clubs. She's organized charity galas that have raised over £2 million for educational initiatives, using her extensive social network to advance causes she once didn't understand. The transformation of my family reflects a broader shift I've witnessed throughout society. When I began speaking publicly about learning differences 15 years ago, audiences were politely interested but often skeptical. Today, the conversation has evolved dramatically. Neurodiversity is increasingly understood not as a medical condition requiring treatment, but as a natural variation in human cognition that brings unique strengths. Major corporations are actively recruiting neurodiverse talent. Universities are redesigning assessment methods to be more inclusive. Schools are training teachers to recognize and nurture different types of intelligence. It's not perfect. We still have miles to go before truly inclusive education becomes universal. But the direction of change is clear, and the momentum is building. Standing here today, reflecting on this journey from dismissed child to international consultant, I'm struck by how the story has become larger than my personal triumph. It's become part of a collective awakening to the extraordinary potential that exists in every human mind, waiting to be recognized and developed. The girl who was told she wasn't smart enough to succeed has spent the last decade proving that intelligence itself is far more complex, diverse, and beautiful than anyone imagined. And every day, through our work, through the students we support, through the systems we help change, that proof becomes more compelling. This is my message to anyone who has ever been told they're not enough. Your worth isn't determined by other people's limited ability to see your potential. Your intelligence isn't diminished by your struggles. It's revealed by how you overcome them. Your differences aren't deficits. They're the very qualities that might allow you to solve problems others can't even see. The world needs minds that work differently. It needs people who ask uncomfortable questions, who see patterns others miss, who refuse to accept that, this is how things have always been done, is an adequate reason to stop innovating. So to every child sitting in a classroom right now, feeling stupid because the lessons don't make sense, you're not broken. The system is. To every parent wondering if their struggling student has a future. They do, but it might look different than you expected. And that difference might be exactly what makes it extraordinary. To every educator who encounters students who don't fit traditional molds. Dig deeper. Look closer. The child who can't read might be the one who grows up to revolutionize how we think about learning itself. And to my 7-year-old self, hiding behind that study door, absorbing all those devastating assessments of her worth, you're going to prove them wrong in ways they can't even imagine. Your struggles will become your strengths. Your differences will become your superpowers. Your story will help change the world. Because that's what happens when you refuse to accept other people's limitations on your potential. That's what happens when you transform doubt into determination, struggle into strength, and underestimation into unstoppable success. They said I wasn't smart enough to succeed. They were wrong about everything except one thing. I am indeed smart enough. Smart enough to see beyond their narrow definitions. Smart enough to create new possibilities. Smart enough to prove that intelligence, like success itself, comes in infinite forms. And if I can do it, so can you.